They were warned. They went anyway. Why? Caves and springs look like invitations, dark mouths opening into cool, still air, or crystal water that seems to promise secrets. For many, they offer a lure, the thrill of discovery, the desire to push a limit, the quiet beauty of a hidden world. But beneath that invitation are forces that do not negotiate with human intentions: sudden currents, collapsing rock, water that can rise in minutes like a living thing. This is the story of three different entrances into that domain, three choices, three sets of warnings, and three tragic outcomes that reveal why people sometimes ignore what they are told. To understand these incidents, we first need a simple map of the environment. A spring is where groundwater forces its way back to the surface. Some are calm pools. Others are runs that pour out like a river from a hole in the earth. A cave system connected to a spring often contains siphons, underwater tunnels that can extend deep and narrow, where visibility drops to almost nothing. Divers moving through a siphon rely on a guideline, a line they attach and follow so they can find their way back. Their regulators, the devices that let them breathe from their tanks, are trusted mechanical lifelines. An octopus is a backup regulator used for sharing air with a partner. Even with these tools, the underwater cave is a place where a single failure, a single misjudgment, can become catastrophic. April 14, 1990. Troy Springs sits as a clear, deceptively serene pool in the Florida landscape, but underneath that placid surface flows a current that can behave with the force of a hose. On that spring, two teenage cousins, Clarence and Richard, went looking for an adventure. They were young, they were curious, and as so often happens with youth, they felt invincible enough to test the limits of the place. Both were familiar with the idea of the spring as a local playground. Friends and family had warned them not to venture too deep. Some of those warnings were explicit, others tacit, the kind of advice that circulates in a community but is not always enforced. The preparation they took reflected that attitude. Each boy carried a single tank. Their guideline was not a proper cave reel but a fishing spool, light, unreliable, and prone to snags. They did not have an octopus between them, which meant they lacked a built-in redundancy for sharing air in an emergency. At approximately 55 feet below the surface, the run constricts and water funnels with increasing speed. It is the sort of place where skill and equipment are not optional. A regulator on one of the boys began to free flow, a technical failure where air rushes uncontrollably out of the regulator, producing a cloud of bubbles that can obscure vision, deplete the tank's contents faster than normal, and force an immediate response. In a confined underwater passage, the sudden appearance of bubbles is not merely a distraction, it becomes an assault on the senses. Panic, already a peril underwater, can set in within seconds. According to the reports, the boys attempted to cope by sharing the functioning regulator between them. In the chaos, the current worked like a conveyor, pushing them along while the fishing line guideline tangled around legs and gear. When rescue teams reached them, both were found heavily entangled. Paradoxically, some air remained in the tank that was still operating, but the entanglement and disorientation prevented them from making the ascent. In the end, 2 lives were lost in a place where a more conservative choice, waiting, better equipment, a trained partner, might have averted the outcome. That is a bare account of what happened at Troy Spring, and beneath that account lie the patterns that keep reappearing whenever people step past a warning: youthful confidence, inadequate equipment, shortcuts that seem good enough, and the powerful underestimation of environmental force. The boys had been warned. They went anyway. Their story raises the first of the persistent questions. When does curiosity become recklessness, and why do warnings fail to carry the weight they should?
If this story is resonating with you and you want more in-depth examinations like this, consider subscribing or leaving a suggestion in the description. Your input helps shape future episodes. May 5th, 2022. The scene shifts from teenagers in local springs to a classroom-sized group of children and a guide whose life was defined by leading others into nature. Sabine, 55 years old, was an experienced nature instructor, someone who had spent decades guiding school groups through forests, along streams, and into modest caves. She was not an explorer seeking to push limits. She was a professional tasked with the safety of young students, responsible for shepherding curiosity into learning. On that spring day at Sassenage Cave, a routine field trip took a turn that no one anticipated. The cave system at Sassenage is not a deep underwater labyrinth like some of the specialized sites used by cave divers. It is, however, tied to the rhythms of weather. Rain miles away can funnel into an underground network and, in a matter of minutes, turn a walkable passage into a rushing torrent. That day, the rain came hard and fast, a flash flood that arrived without adequate warning in the immediate setting. Sabine reacted. In the sudden chaos of water surging where there had been air and dry rock, she reached to pull a child to safety. Her instinct, formed through years of guiding, training, and a professional ethic of care, was to shield those in her charge. She succeeded in getting a student out of harm's way, but the torrent took her. She was swept away by the force of the flood. Her colleagues and the other students survived. Sabine did not.
This case is crucial because it complicates the assumption that tragedy emerges only from ignorance or arrogance. Sabine did not ignore a warning. It is possible that no one expected the scale and rapidity of that flood. Sometimes the warning signs exist but are not visible in time. Here, the primary threat was the environment's sudden change, not human hubris. Sabine's actions were an enactment of duty and courage. She saved at least one life in a decision made in an instant, a reminder that the calculus that leads people to enter or remain in risky places is not always simple self-endangerment, but can be obligation, care, and split-second moral choice. Early April 2022. A different kind of scene unfolds beneath the water at Kossuth Cave, often referred to in reports as Siphon 3, a site that had drawn the interest of specialists for years. Martin, known to friends as Marcy, was an elite cave diver, methodical, experienced, a researcher as much as an explorer. People like Marcy train for years to navigate the narrow, dark arteries of underwater caves. They plan, they establish lines, they carry redundancies, and they operate with an understanding of both the mechanics of equipment and the geology that can betray them. When Marcy pushed beyond Siphon 3, he did so in a spirit of exploration that the cave diving community understands, to map more of a system, to learn what lies beyond, to expand knowledge. He was meticulous in his methods, placing new anchors and proceeding with a discipline that would give others confidence in following in his wake. Despite that, on his return, the passage beyond a certain point, shallow enough that silt and clay could be disturbed, collapsed. Evidence suggests the clay or rock gave way, blocking the tunnel behind him. Rescue teams, including Victor and Andrus among others, mobilized quickly. Cave rescue is slow, technical, and often dangerous for the rescuers themselves. Every inch of progress is measured against the risk of inducing further collapse, of increasing silt, and destroying visibility. Victor, one of those who ventured into the siphon in the search, located Marcy approximately 98 feet into Siphon 3, beyond the collapsed section. The recovery operation took days. The local community organized memorials, and divers who had trained and worked alongside Marcy honored him with a ceremony that acknowledged both his contributions and the limits of what control and preparation can achieve. Marcy's death is a painful lesson in an uncomfortable truth.
expertise reduces risk but cannot eliminate the geological and physical uncertainties inherent to subterranean spaces. He did not ignore warnings. If anything, he embodied the cautious, professional approach. Yet nature presented a failure mode no amount of planning could wholly forestall. When these three narratives are placed side by side, certain patterns become clearer, and not all of them conform to simple moral judgments.
The question posed by the title, why they ignored the warning and entered the deadly cave, needs to be reframed slightly. Sometimes warnings are ignored, sometimes they are followed. Sometimes there are no warnings to follow because the hazard appears in a way that makes prior caution insufficient. Still, a comparative reading of these events points to several recurring human and environmental factors. First, there is the psychology of risk. People perceive and evaluate risk differently, depending on age, context, and group dynamics. In the Troy Spring case, youth and a local culture that may have normalized casual water play contributed to a sense of invulnerability. Teenagers discount long-term consequences. They focus on immediate goals. Social pressure and the desire to prove competence to peers create a motivation to push past cautions. The precautionary advice becomes background noise in the face of the immediate pull of adventure. Second, equipment and preparation matter. A fishing line is not a guideline. A single tank without an octopus is not redundancy. These are not moral failings so much as an underestimation of how quickly things can turn. Technical terms here deserve brief explanation. A regulator is the mouthpiece and assembly that lets a diver breathe from a compressed air tank. A free flow is when the regulator begins to allow air to escape uncontrollably, creating a stream of bubbles and a rapid loss of breathable supply. A guideline is a physical line laid by divers so they can find their way back through the often featureless underground passages. An octopus is a backup regulator used for sharing air with a partner in emergencies. In Troy Spring, the combination of inadequate guideline and lack of redundant breathing options turned a technical failure into a fatal sequence. Third, there is the factor of professional obligation and split-second moral choice, exemplified by Sabine. She did not enter the cave to test herself. She entered it as part of her work. Even with experience, individuals charged with the care of others make different calculations. When she acted to preserve a life. This shows why some warnings are not ignored, but are instead superseded by the immediate ethical demand to protect another person. The cost of heroism can be fatal, and history is grimly full of examples where rescuers pay with their lives. These are not failures of judgment in the ordinary sense. They are moments where human solidarity outruns self-preservation. Fourth, geological unpredictability remains a wild card. In Marcy's case, the likely collapse of clay and rock is a hazard that is always present in caves, but not always visible or foreseeable. Even the most meticulous anchor placement and line laying cannot prevent a piece of the passage from failing. The physics of water and subterranean sediment means that a small movement, a subtle pressure change, can trigger a collapse.
When that happens in a narrow, silted passage, the survivability window is extremely small. Fifth, social normalization of deviance can creep into any environment where risky behavior repeatedly fails to produce immediate negative results. If people enter caves repeatedly without incident, they come to believe those conditions are safe. This creates a gradual erosion of cautions and reliance on ad hoc solutions. That was likely a factor at Troy Spring, where local familiarity diminished perceived danger. Sixth, there is the problem of communication. Warnings can exist but have different forms: a sign at an entrance, a verbal caution from a family member, or a policy that is not enforced.
The more diffuse the warning, the easier it is to disregard. In places where informal local knowledge substitutes for formal safety protocols, the message weakens into suggestion rather than strict prohibition. None of these explanations single-handedly accounts for every tragedy. Most incidents emerge from an unlucky joining of human decisions and environmental forces. The forensic view of these events must therefore be multifactorial. A free-flow regulator becomes deadly when combined with an inadequate guideline and a strong current. A flash flood becomes deadly when it arrives faster than a group can react. A collapse becomes deadly when a diver is beyond a choke point with limited retreat options. Rescue and recovery efforts reveal another layer of the human cost. In each case, teams mobilized, local divers, trained cave rescue volunteers, and authorities who coordinated searches under dangerous conditions. At Troy Spring, the recovery showed the entanglement and physical reality of the hazard in stark terms. At Sassenage, rescuers were confronted with a swift-changing environment and the emotional weight of children who had seen a teacher swept away. At Casith, the slow, technical work of penetrating a siphon to locate Marcy demanded patience, expertise, and a willingness to place oneself at risk in order to bring closure. Those who carry out these recoveries deserve particular acknowledgement. The rescuers who enter with the knowledge of what could go wrong and still proceed, not because they are reckless, but because they value recovering a friend, a child, a colleague, or a community member. The toll on rescuers is not only physical, it is psychological. Witnessing fatalities, working in constrained, dark spaces, and the necessity of bringing bodies to the surface takes a weight that lingers long after the operation ends. How then should society process the lessons of these tragedies without slipping into simplistic prescriptions? First, respect for warnings must be emphasized, not as an abstract moralism, but as an acknowledgement of the real power of the environment. A posted sign or a parental caution is not merely a suggestion, it represents local knowledge and often a history of incidents that others have paid for.
When a place is known to have dangerous currents or unstable passages, the burden of proof lies with those who decide to proceed to show why the risk has been mitigated. Second, training and appropriate equipment reduce but do not erase risk. A formal training regime teaches not only technical skills, but an approach to risk assessment, redundancy, and refusal. Proper guideline reels, redundant regulators, and a conservative approach to penetration distances are part of that toolkit. But training cannot substitute for humility in the face of an environment that can change in minutes. Third, social and psychological pressures need to be acknowledged. Peer dynamics, pride, and the desire to impress can push people past sensible limits. Creating a culture where caution is valued and where turning back is not stigmatized is essential. This is as much about community norms as it is about individual choices. Fourth, for professionals whose role is to protect others, there should be recognition of the dangers inherent to that role and support structures that help manage them. Sabine's decision to act was heroic, but it also underscores that people who work with groups in variable environments need institutional support for risk management, including contingency plans and communication channels that can be activated when weather patterns change unexpectedly. Fifth, public information must be clear and consistent. A sign that reads, "Enter at your own risk," communicates differently from a sign that spells out specific hazards, recommended gear, and recent weather advisories. Better signage, community outreach, and, where possible, real-time alerts about sudden weather events can help translate general cautions into actionable information. Sixth, accept that not all tragedies are preventable. Acknowledging the limits of human control is difficult, but honest.
There will be events, sudden, violent floods or geological collapses that even the best training and equipment cannot fully mitigate. This acceptance does not absolve the search for improvement, but it tempers the impulse to assign blame where factors were genuinely beyond control. Beyond practical lessons, these incidents carry a moral weight that shapes how communities remember those who died. Clarence and Richard became part of a cautionary tale about youth and risk. Sabine became a symbol of selfless protection, a professional whose last act embodied the vocation she had chosen. Marcy became a somber reminder that even the best of us can encounter the limits of expertise when the earth itself gives way. Memorials followed. Local gatherings honored the cousins at Troy Spring. Sabine's community held a quiet remembrance for the woman who taught children to love the outdoors. Marcy's colleagues organized a tribute that acknowledged his contributions to the study of caves and the world of technical diving. These acts of remembrance are not simply ritual. They serve as communal attempts to reweave trust into environments that have been marked by loss, to enforce a narrative that remembers without sensationalizing. In the end, the question why they ignored the warning and entered the deadly cave must be answered in 3 parts. For some, like the teenagers at Troy Spring, warnings were present but undercut by youth, local normalization of risk, and inadequate equipment. For others, like Sabine, the warning system failed in the face of a sudden environmental change, and the decisive action that followed was not the ignoring of a warning, but a rapid moral choice to protect another. For experts like Marcy, the pursuit of knowledge took place in a setting where geological failure was always possible. Their deaths remind us that expertise reduces probability but does not eradicate contingency. Only by holding these different threads together can a fuller picture emerge, not a simple morality play about obeying signs, but a nuanced examination of how human psychology, social dynamics, technical systems, and the raw unpredictability of nature combine to produce outcomes that are sometimes tragic. If there is a single practical prompt from these stories, it is a call for humility and preparation that goes beyond checklist thinking. Respect local knowledge, treat warnings as serious, invest in proper equipment and training, cultivate a culture where turning back is valorized as a wise choice rather than a failure. Support those who lead and protect with resources and protocols that help them make safe choices under pressure. And recognize with both sorrow and sobriety that the natural world is neither an opponent to defeat nor a playground to dominate. It is a realm that demands respect. We close with 2 necessary acts, a tribute and an appeal. To Clarence and Richard, whose youthful curiosity met the unyielding force of a current. To Sabine, who gave her life in the effort to protect a child. To Marcy, who pushed the boundaries of knowledge and paid a price no one wished for. To the rescuers, Victor and Andrus among them, and to the many volunteers whose expertise and courage brought closure and comfort to grieving families. Their stories insist that we remember them fully, not as dramatic headlines, but as people with names, families, and lives interrupted. If this examination moved you, consider supporting the channel or joining our Patreon. Links in the description. Your support helps fund further reporting and honors these stories with the care they deserve. Warnings are not simply words on a sign, they are condensed lessons. Sometimes we ignore them because we think ourselves different from those who suffered before. Sometimes we cannot see the danger that arrives in a single fatal instant.
Whatever the case, the proper response is not only to learn from each tragic closure, but to change the way we act in similar moments, to choose caution over bravado, preparation over improvisation, and the preservation of life over the pursuit of a momentary thrill. In remembering, we can build practices and communities less prone to the mistakes that claimed these lives, and less likely to let warnings pass us by.